that the introductions should speak for themselves. So one of the things that we're obviously covering a lot in this meeting is integrating data and trying to understand how we can take very different data modalities. Oh, there you go. And begin to really understand how the brain functions and have that influence AI, have AI influence how we understand how the brain functions. In order to do that, you have to have a number of very different kinds of people involved. So we've got 4 very different people up here who work in the field and use different approaches, have different backgrounds, have different ways of thinking about things. And rather than me read out their CVs, if you really want to see their pedigrees, you can lift up your phone and go look them up. What I wanted them to do is, because this is a training day, and it's really important to be influenced by people who are leaders in the field, I've asked them to introduce themselves, but not with their academic CV, but with giving the rest of the people here an idea of where they came from, where their interests began, whether or not they've detoured or pivoted along the way, and anybody or any one thing that influenced them to think differently about how they do science. So I'm going to start with Christian, then Amy, then Michele, and then Rachel.
All right. Let's see if I can answer all your questions. Hi, I'm Christian. I'm working in Jülich at the Research Center in the Institute of Neuroscience and Medicine, INM1, being at the moment a young investigator group leader for the group Large Scale AI for Brain Mapping, focusing mostly on microscopy. I actually started my career, so right after school, as doing my bachelor in scientific programming at a software company, having nothing to do with science. So a software company that did enterprise resource planning software, so stuff like SAP, if you know that. And so the thing is that this program was in combination with, jointly with people that were also working at the research center in Jülich. And I remember the first joint seminar that we had, so where people basically came with their institutes and their companies, presenting the stuff that they were doing. And I presented, I don't know what, something about, I don't know, integrating a new button into some software. And then people came with particle accelerators, people putting brains in microtomes, cutting them. It was like, it's so much cooler. And this is the point where I decided to switch sides and switch to science. And after that, I did my master in technomathematics. It's translated to English, I think. And then my PhD in computer science. Yeah, and now I'm doing AI for microscopy.
Hi, I'm Amy. I guess I am a physicist by background. I am an engineer by job title. I'm a STEMinist by heart, and I am continuously baffled by brains. I did physics for my undergraduate, and I actually wanted to do microscope development, and I applied to do my PhD in 2-photon imaging of fruit fly brains, which would have been slightly different. Very interesting, but slightly different. And before that, I was actually, I built high-powered lasers for research, so I was a laser engineer for a bit. And I was on one of these amazing CDT or doctoral training schemes where I got to do 2 projects. And it was to do with, it could be biomedical imaging of any sort, right? So it was from optics all the way to ultrasound and MRI. And I thought, MRI is about the opposite of what I think I want to do. So let's do 3 months in that. And yeah, I fell in love with it, and I thought it was a bit better than, endlessly twiddling dark knobs on mirrors in a dark lab for many months. So I ended up doing a bit of both, and I'm very lucky that I now get to do a bit of both. So I do a bit of microscopy acquisition, I do MRI acquisition, and then developing kind of integrative methods to figure out how to combine the two. So,
Michele.
My turn? Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. Okay, so I'm currently assistant professor in the Department of Physics here. started doing neuroscience in 2015. This was both an effect of chance and of choice. I'll explain why. So it's strange, but so I had a job interview to get my current position, and in that occasion I managed in a very hypocritical exercise, which was trying to make my CV looks like a perfectly consequential one. And I really did. I mean, when I heard it, it was like, okay, yeah, I went there because it's not true. So mine is a typical career path full of turns. And in particular, I had a big turn in the end of my PhD because I got disappointed with what I was doing. So I was specializing in quantum information science, which was intellectually very fascinating. But at the end of my PhD, I realized this is not what I want to do because I felt it was too abstract for me. I felt it made me wander in a very intellectual world, very detached from ordinary reality. At a certain point, this almost made me feel depressed, and I decided that I would change my career towards something else. And I really wanted to do something related to biology, so go in the direction of living beings. And I stumbled into neuroscience by chance, because actually I was desperately trying to find a postdoc in a different field from the one I had specialized in. And at a certain point, I had an opportunity to start collaborating in data analysis with a group in the International School for Advanced Studies in Trieste. And they wanted to apply data analysis techniques to neuroscience. And I said, looks nice. I should really seize this opportunity because I don't know if I'm going to have an equally good one. And I went. And a posteriori, I can say it was really a good choice. I think if I could go back, I would become a computational neuroscientist in the first place. So I would do a different career path. I really like neuroscience. I like it because there are many, many open questions. So in physics, I really like studying it. It's intellectually amazing. But in quantum mechanics, the fundamental theory is understood. In neuroscience, no. There are still many fundamental facts that are defying our understanding in fundamental ways. And so I became a data analyst, and I specialized in MRI. This was because of my first postdoc. And I became interested in connectivity, and lately also, having worked a lot with data, I'm really interested in modeling as a physicist. I think neuroscience needs more modeling, but not necessarily in the sense of models, of computational models, but of also conceptual models. So one of the challenges we have, I think, so as a physicist, I'm sometimes frustrated by the lack of theory. Theory by meaning fundamental concepts. So we have wonderful data, but sometimes we are confused, and I don't know. Did I reply?
Yeah. Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel. I'm a scientist at the Allen Institute for Brain Science. And I guess my path really didn't pivot too much because my bachelor's degree, I double majored in neuroscience and German. And then after my bachelor's degree, I went straight into my PhD, which was also neuroscience. Because in the US, you don't necessarily need a master's to apply to PhD programs. So I went straight from bachelor's to PhD. But I always knew I didn't want to be an academic PI. I didn't want to run my own research lab. I knew that from day one. And I told my PhD advisor that pretty soon after joining his lab. I was always interested in bigger picture things like science communication and science policy and science outreach, because I always thought, if we have such exciting things going on inside the lab, but no one knows about it, besides other scientists, then that's a huge problem, right? If, the general public doesn't know about these advances, if our policymakers, who decide the budget and decide, how much money the NIH gets, if they don't understand that, then that's, a huge issue. So during graduate school, I did a number of different fellowships and internships and just volunteer activities related to science policy and science communication. And it's really an interesting practice to try to explain your dissertation topic to your senator, to your senator's office, and explain why you should care about somatostatin inhibitory interneurons in the barrel cortex of the mouse, even though we're not mice. Just really getting, people outside of science to understand that has always been, an interest of mine. And then at the Allen Institute, that's sort of what my job is about. I'm not actually involved in I'm not a research scientist at the Institute. I'm more of an application scientist, so I'm involved with, providing, training and tutorials to other scientists, and sometimes also the general public, and also some opportunities to, college-aged researchers or, people in high school as well. So that's sort of, that's been my path.
So a big part of this session isn't just to have you listen to us say things about stuff. It's to give you a flavor of who's doing what and how they think about things, because you've got 3 days yet, and if we can race through these questions, you'll have a glass of wine or beer in your hand in an hour or so, and everybody hopefully will have enough energy to keep fielding questions. One big question that came up that Christian has volunteered to field, because we had a quick prep call. About a year ago, I was in this region in Turin at a conference on machine learning, and almost every talk had that much math in it. It's been a while since I've sat through that, and it really struck me what a different world we live in right now. I was trained as a neuroscientist also, and we now live in this world where we've got acronyms upon acronyms. We've got machine learning, we've got AI, we've got large language models, we've got deep learning, we've got federated learning. All these brand new terms that weren't really a part of the neuroscience vernacular routinely 10 years ago. So Christian said he'd be willing to step up. For anybody here, and having taught very smart people for a long time, I know there are people in the audience who probably cannot tell us what they think is the difference between deep learning and machine learning. So Christian's going to take this one on.
Yeah, let the battle of definitions begin. Okay, so in our prep call, I already said that a few years ago I would have just said that machine learning is written in Python and AI is written in PowerPoint. But this has changed a little bit. So if we go through the terms that you named, I would say, so let's start with deep learning. So deep learning is generally everything that involves neural networks operating on raw data, so images, text, audio. So I really like this definition really by the data and not by the depth of the network, which is also the definition that this famous deep learning book takes. So I actually like this better because this makes it more concrete. Because otherwise, you ask what is deep? 10, 100, 1,000 layers. Right. Then I would say deep learning is a machine learning method, and machine learning is fancy statistics. Yeah. At least this was what my...
Large language models.
Large language models. Large language models are a specific type of machine learning models which are trained on huge amounts of text in a self-supervised fashion, so without a specific purpose, but with a general task that just by the sheer amount of data that they operate on have these emerging properties, which also brings us to the next buzzword, which is foundation models. So these general purpose models, which can just by being trained on such a generic task and such a giant amount of data and having so many parameters, have these emerging properties. So it's basically actually in the paper that defines this foundation model term, they have this very, very nice timeline where it basically goes from deep learning, where you design architectures to for very specific tasks, to these foundation models where you design, where you use a generic architecture and you so to say, just design the data set that you're training on.
All right. Does anybody have any other questions that are in this vein that require definition? All right. So next question is one that Christian and Michael volunteered to field, but anybody else is willing, feel happy to jump in. I wanted to know which computational tools, platforms, algorithms, whatever, have made the most difference in changing how you do science. Do you want to start?
Yeah. It's a tough question because for a long time I haven't been using very advanced algorithms. So in my postdoc I was working like pretty much with very simple things. I think lately I'm integrating deep learning in my research, and I think it's, even though at the beginning I did not like it because it felt too automatic, and for my taste it's like I want to understand what happens, but in the end it's not that obscure as it might be, and I'm slowly starting to integrate this in my routine.
Now, are there any particular platforms that you get your data from, or is it all in-house?
It's in-house. So I've been, again, I accept that I have been working with a large platform, the Human Connectome Project's database, and I think that can also change. The way we do science, in the sense having access to well-organized data in that way, but there are also dangers, if I can say this. It can also promote conformity. So one of the dangers I see is, we have the Human Connectome Project data. Many people have used them, so many people have pre-process them in a certain way. The very fact that everybody has done something does not mean that analysis is either correct or is optimal for what you want to look at. And I think one of the dangers in having access to shared databases is some people could have access that did not take enough time to check enough about what the data are and whether they have been pre-treated correctly for their research question. And so I'm very much in favor of large platforms, but I think this must go along with training to use them. So I have used the HBP data as a self-trainee. So I think in most of what I do in the last years as a physicist turned into neuroscience, I have self-taught myself things, and I don't think I've done this very well all the time. So I really think I myself lack many. I should take courses about how you work with large databases. I haven't done this, but I think it's a relevant thing.
Good to know.
Yeah, I thought about this a little bit because I first thought, okay, which algorithm was the most important one? But I don't think that is an algorithm. I think for me it's version control and provenance tracking. So for tools, stuff like Git, GitAnnex, DataLet at the moment, or SnakeMake. So basically, first tools that allow you to version your stuff, and not only your code, but all of the things like data and models, publications. At some point, I even went so far and version slides. So I could tell you the commit that I generated the figure in a slide with, but I sadly had to give up on this because PowerPoint. And this did not change, so this did change the way I work quite significantly, not because, so first, of course, because you have your stuff versioned and backup and so on, which is good, but also especially the provenance tracking. So you have to imagine basically when you run a script, you have to do it in a way that can be tracked. This means that you have to think about how you do the things. Like if it's a script and you run it, that's totally fine. As soon as you have to, for example, start up a fancy application, this changes because this makes it more difficult to track it automatically.
So did you write your own script for that, for your data, or did you go to GitHub and find something to tweak?
So I used for the provenance tracking. I used the data-led tool. So this is publicly available and is based on Git and Git Annex.
Yeah.
Works very flawlessly with them. What I had to do myself is think about which workflows work well with these, because there are, for example, applications so scripts are no-brainer. These just work. There are applications which you cannot fully track because for example, if you have to create a labeling by hand, of course this is difficult to track. But there are software which allows you to save what you did in a persistent and good format, which you can just version. And there are tools which you just start, and then after 2 hours you close them, and there's no track of what you did except for the end result. Yeah. So, and this made me think, because it makes the stuff more reproducible. So this was actually very useful, thinking about this and basically taking this, making this a first-class citizen of how you design your research stuff.
Great. I don't know if Amy or Rachel have anything to add to that, but you're getting the next question if you don't, and if you do, just add it in. So this is from the perspective of people who were involved in both producing and analyzing data. How much effort do you put in, you or your consortium or your colleagues, to really planning the experiment and the data around the people who will use it, understanding of end user, how they'll use it, what they might use it for, and how important is this becoming in your work?
Yeah, I think we've put in a huge amount of effort into curating data, as you say. Particularly like microscopy data, like a lot of what we've done is, we have a data set, we have microscopy and MRI, and really I want to get the microscopy into a state where people who just do neuroimaging can pick it up and use it in a kind of meaningful way. And obviously that data curation is painful quite often. There's a lot of like staining, artifacts, etc. It took a lot of like talking to neuropathologists about, what do you care about? Like, do you care about how much myelin or different levels or whatever? And so there's been quite a lot of trying to develop like machine learning methods so that we can, efficiently process in automated ways a large number of slides and then translate that information into like a nifty file that anyone can pick up, and hopefully it has meaningful outputs that people can easily use. I think within like our group, there's a lot of, because we also work with people who like develop FSL, there's always a bit of a challenge between you can make the most like generalizable tool in the world, but then it requires, a complicated config file to make it run in this situation, or another complicated config file to make it run in a different situation. So there's always this like balance between creating some highly generalizable tool, but which requires a bit more user input, or something that's very, automated and step back from. So
do you track who's using it and how well they're using it? Does that feed into any kind of tweaking to make things better?
I mean, I can't really speak on behalf of FSL. They do a lot of tracking because they have like the FSL mailing list and whatever. But yeah, on what we do, like we always ask for feedback. And within the lab, we have other groups that are using stuff. So we have also a continuous, between ourselves, feedback, right, on each other's work. So that's helpful.
Yeah, so being at a huge institution like the Allen Institute, there's almost 1,000 people that work there. So there are these individual teams that are involved in different parts of the data production, right? So there's an entire team devoted just to dealing, with the tissue samples. There's an entire team dealing with transcriptomics. There's a separate team dealing with imaging, a separate team dealing with, building the website and the tools to showcase all this data. So there's all these different points that the data has to go through before it gets online. So there's lots of different thresholds and quality control measurements at each of those stops. So by the time something goes all the way through and gets on the website, it's extremely high quality data that has gone through, hundreds of people at that point. And I think there's this recognition that not every neuroscientist has a coding background or has a programming background, and so that's why we have some of the tools that I showcased this morning that are designed to be user-friendly. You don't need to download anything, you can just use the browser. But then we also have, a number of, things on our GitHub. If you just want the code, if you don't care about the browser annoys, the browser tool annoys you, you just want to bypass it, that's also an option. We've also created some Jupyter notebooks, and it's funny because I have very limited programming background, so I've actually been, the test subject on some of these Jupyter notebooks to see can the average neuroscientist figure this out, and does this help to access the data? So I've volunteered myself for some of those positions, to figure out, okay, is this actually accessible to people who don't have much of a Python background? So I think, and it's interesting, because my background was all, I really didn't use much programming at all in my PhD work. I wish I had learned about it earlier. I wish I had learned Python and R for some of I was doing a lot of microscopy work, a lot of confocal imaging and super resolution imaging. And now looking back, I realize, that would have been a useful thing to learn, at the beginning of my PhD. But now I'm trying to, catch up and learn new things. But it's interesting talking, to the software engineers or people with stronger programming backgrounds. And, sometimes there's an assumption that, a neuroscientist would know what this code means or know what this is. And that's not necessarily true. And I, show myself as an example for that. So it's definitely, it's nice working at an institute where you have people from very different backgrounds working together, and I'm excited that I get to work with our data and technology team because I hear feedback from people on, was this tool useful, what parts are, good, what parts are annoying, what features should we add to it, and then I send that message back and say, hey, here's what people in the neuroscience community like or don't like or, have questions about. Because if you're not getting feedback, then how do you know who's actually using your tool? Is it actually useful? What's the benefit? A lot of work and effort went into making the tool, so you actually want it, to be used by people.
Okay, so we're jumping ahead a bit because you just touched. Because you just touched on this, and I know this is something that many different groups are grappling with. But from your own experience, you've got your experts in machine learning and AI, you've got your experts in neuroscience in all its glory, various different subsets of neuroscience investigation. Do we speak enough of the same language to be able to cross these bridges and tackle some of these really important questions on the AI side of things? Mike Horowitz has an answer or a question.
I have no answers.
Oh, you have plenty of answers, this I know.
Interesting. So this is a question. So The Economist had an article last week, I don't know if you saw it, it was called, "Why Don't Women Use Artificial Intelligence? Even when in the same jobs, men are much more likely to turn to the tech." And it goes on to all these things. And the question, I guess, is that, do we find this to be the case in science? And do we find this to be the case in neuroscience? And if so, what can we do about that? That's my question.
About getting more women to use AI?
Yeah, gender balance. So there's also that, and also there's another thing too, is that there's a kind of a tech balance too, where people who don't come from more technical backgrounds are more afraid to kind of go into that. So I'm interested in your opinions on this. So.
Yeah, which is along the lines of what we were just about to get into. I think Amy has opinions on this.
It's a really interesting question, and I think if you look at who's using AI and who's publishing in AI and who are on the board of the big AI companies, like the lack of women is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. And I do think that if we're not careful, it's going to create a even larger disparity between genders, is that, women will not be encouraged to get involved in this, and that there will be more, AI is going to make a huge amount of money, and we need to think, who's that money going to? Like, whose jobs are getting lost, and whose data is it? Who's benefiting from this? But yeah, I saw there was a news article the other day that said, now we have ChatGPT, we can all give up coding. We don't need to learn to code. And like, I would completely disagree with that, right? Like, if you know how to manipulate the systems, if you know how to work with these tools, you're going to be phenomenally better, better off. And what really annoyed me was that the picture that they had with this was of a little girl learning to code. And I was like, why have you managed to like know? But I do think, I think there's also a huge amount of promise in this, right? For example, if you want to learn a new language, using like ChatGPT to translate code into a new language, and then looking at the syntax and understanding, like, there's so much that you can learn from these models. But yeah, like, I think it's something we need to talk about.
Anybody else want to pick up on the people who are different talking to each other and beginning to be able to have what it takes to develop what we need in order to, because we do need to build bridges. It's quite clear that there are these spaces in the middle, and it's going to take talent of varying different kinds to fill them. Are we going in the right direction? Do we have enough? Or what do we need to do about it? Michael's eagerly putting his hand up. But why don't you two take this?
Yeah, so this building bridge, yeah, I think in my mind, initially I always thought like programming and coding was more like engineering type, and I was like, oh, well, I'm not an engineer, so I don't need to learn that. But, as I progressed through my PhD program, I actually learned, how untrue that was and how useful it can be for a number of other things. And so, in my PhD program, there was no programming courses that were required, or really, if there were, it was more from a computer science perspective. And, even this past year, I signed up for a Python course at the University of Washington, because I was like, well, I should probably start to learn Python now. And even that was very much, from a computer science programming standpoint. So it was a little, it was a general intro to Python class, not a, bioinformatician type of Python class. So even that, it was a bit tricky for me to figure out, well, how is this actually useful towards me? So I don't know. Maybe I should have picked more bioinformatics, structured class, but I think if you have no background at all in programming, it can be a little tricky to figure out how do you break in, because at least, in my experience, certain things do very much be structured towards engineering or that type of programming, which is very different from creating new maps or analyzing data or doing clustering, which is more what your neuroscientists would use that for. So.
Yeah, about the interaction of people with different backgrounds.
Yeah.
I think it's, of course, about sharing techniques. I think here, actually, there is something where an artificial intelligence might really help. So there is a problem of vocabulary. So I think a tool that might be really interesting, and perhaps a tool that could be set up with an artificial intelligence, would be a really translator of the same term used by scientists with different background, because sometimes we use the word state, or many words are intended differently, and I think if you read papers by different communities, the terms are used in different ways. I think to the point that a well-trained large language model may even be able to construct a vocabulary and translate, and this might help. One problem is vocabulary. We use the same words for different concepts, and this is one problem. And the other problem is much more difficult. So even if we share the same tools and same knowledge, the background, people have been told that some questions are more relevant than others, depending on their background. And so we need a supplemental effort to come along together and agree on what are the important questions, because depending on where you come from, you have been told that some things are important and some other are not. So, and this is harder. I don't know how to solve this, actually.
We need to talk to each other more. I mainly wanted to ask them this because, Alan, please go ahead.
All right, so this is a bit of a devil's advocate.
Yeah. Can you yell it, or I'll repeat it? There you go.
Okay, so we're all told that AI will solve everything.
Yep.
And it seems to me that the outset of this revolution, what we were essentially doing was taking a bunch of data, splitting it into a set of nodes, a set of layers, one of which not clear how many you should use. And out the bottom came a set of clusters.
Yep.
And we didn't know what those clusters meant. We tried to retrofit some kind of interpretation to it, but I don't know why we shouldn't fund those. All right, so we moved forward, and we started to use generative AI, where we would have some internal model, and we could then assess the parameters of that model,
Yep.
which had a biological interpretation. So then my question really boils down to what is the difference at that point between generative AI with a parameterized model within it and traditional compartmental modeling, multivariate statistics? What's the difference? What is a generative AI going to do for us that traditional strategies don't?
Okay, so who wants to take this? I think Christian.
Yeah, that's actually a very, very good question
Yeah.
that so we also internally in our lab had discussions on quite recently. So I think one way of thinking about it is the generative process. So if you're thinking about some high-dimensional features that your AI model gives you, you have no idea how to approach it. It's just too high-dimensional. You can do view maps and stuff like this, but and the problem is you have to make it digestible or understandable. And by using generative AI, for example, text-based, of course, you're applying another model, but you make it accessible in a way that makes it easier to check it, basically. That's actually that's at least at the moment my idea of how this might be useful. Basically, you transform it into a format which is still abstract, but it's easier for you to read a text and say that's nonsense than look at a feature vector and say that's nonsense. So that would be my take on this at the moment.
I think first the question was, you go to generative AI because you want to parameterize the results, and you have a model that's interpretable by logic. How is that any different from compartmental model or multivariate statistics, where you have parameters of a model?
You mean generative model that is biological?
It's being constrained.
Okay, I see.
Becoming multivariate statistics or becoming compartmental modeling.
Yeah.
You model it so you can understand it.
Right.
It's fast.
I was going to say, right.
And that can be useful. You can do real time. But is it just non-linear optimization?
Okay, so that might lead into what was going to be one of the final questions. Oh, we've got somebody else who has a, go on.
So I think this is kind of in a similar vein, but I guess, so as models are becoming more and more powerful, I think we also are starting to understand less about how they're reaching their conclusions, right? And like what's actually happening behind the scenes. So I guess there are kind of two questions I have related to that. The first one being, do you think we should kind of stop and try to figure out first what's going on with these models before we develop more powerful ones? And secondly, if we do keep developing more powerful models, who's to say that we should focus our energy between optimizing them further or applying them to new tasks? Like, how do we decide like this model is good enough and we should just try and apply it to as many things as possible, or we should keep improving its current performance?
Excellent question. Any big opinions over here? There you go.
It's horrible. I have not an opinion, but I think I fear that this type of question could come out. So in the last 2 or 3 days, I looked something in the literature. I cannot say I have an opinion on this, but some people are thinking about these issues more deeply than I can. There is a nice paper by a group of mainly of theoretical chemists led by Professor Asper Gudzik in Harvard. I think it's 2023. It's I can find it for you. And essentially, it's about how should we use AI for understanding. And they give a very precise definition of understanding based on previous philosophical work about defining understanding. And understanding means also being able to grasp the consequences of something without doing a very long calculation. And they find many examples about how AI can actually help in this direction. So they show that in many cases, AI can discover patterns, and after patterns have been discovered, these patterns provide a building block for a coarse, intuitive understanding that then can be used to formulate theories, even if you don't need, even without need of a lot of additional calculations. But they unfortunately do not give prescriptions about then how should you use AI in order to use it in this way. They don't say anything. So I think this is a very important question, and people around are trying to solve it, to start discussing this.
I would say both is the answer to your question. That you do need to keep refining the models, right? But taking a step back to really understand how the models can be faithfully applied to different sets of questions is something that generally doesn't happen enough. We're all racing through our various avenues of science. One of the things that really hit me recently, and I can't expect us all, like, across the world to begin to, like, harmonize, but I have a family member who's in the thick of this, and they're doing modeling in cancer, but they're taking whole genome sequence data from the UK Biobank, patient data from the UK Biobank, modeling data from experimentalists who've generated cells from those patients that are then put down the lineages of potential cancers that are then single cell sequenced, and they're looking at drug resistance in culture compared to drug responses in the human patients. It's fascinating, so that they can then better stratify and create better predictive models that could actually be, and I'm looking at these patterns and I'm like, wow, we need to do that for ADHD. And they said, what? I said, we need to do exactly the same thing for ADHD, and add in some imaging if possible. Even EEG could inform and add a neurological aspect, layer on top of all that incredible time and energy that's going into creating very robust models for cancer trajectories are the same things we should be thinking about adapting across. And I realize that's a bit of a stretch. And we're having a hard enough time with our various different brain modalities. But that's where, let's take a step back, right? And look at how robust the modeling is and where we could begin to really apply it and make sense. So, moving into the end here, because we are the only thing between you and refreshments, and I believe a welcome reception. I'm curious from each of you about where you think the most promise lies in terms of AI in its various forms really helping us move forward with our understanding of the brain. And in the context of that, where the biggest obstacles perhaps also lie, or problems lie, with respect to overstressing the effectiveness of a model or overinterpreting the effectiveness of a model. So if we can go from right to left.
Oh gosh.
There you go. Sorry, putting you on the spot.
I think it could be really interesting for actually driving hypotheses. So finding like correlations in data or patterns in data that then we can go in and use very traditional, manipulative methods to better understand. So I think that could be really interesting, and I really like also like the more physics-informed AI stuff. So building in everything that we know, building in like biophysical models or whatever. But yeah, I think that's where I would go.
So being able to better analyze the larger amounts of data to feed them through theory into a hypothesis.
Exactly. I mean, it's kind of what, a lot of the early studies of biobank did, right? Is you find a genetic hit from an imaging variable, and then you have to go in and do a lot of the really hard work of, using animal models to try and understand actually what's happening on the brain.
I would actually go in a very, very similar direction. So I think that AI has the potential, maybe not next year, but maybe in a few decades or a decade, to basically integrate all the information that we have and look at it in a way that we just can't, that we are just physically are not able to do. So like make connections between different data sets all over the globe that we just can't because we can't comprehend it. The risk that I see there is basically to have the, so should we arrive at such a model, to run into this ChatGPT effect, like blindly trusting it without any question asking, like asking it if this data looks plausible or what a diagnosis for this symptoms are, and just blindly trusting it. So I don't think that it's unlikely that this would happen. If we would have this model now, if it would now be delivered to our door, we would definitely have this effect, I think.
But what excites you the most? Is it that whole idea that there could be a ChatGPT equivalent in the future where you could just ask it?
This would be cool.
That question, what does this cell that I'm interested in really do? What's it connected to? And how many different subtypes of neuropsychiatric diseases it associated with?
Yes, exactly this.
All right. Michael.
Yeah, I agree with both of you about, especially I think I completely agree on the fact that AI might discover patterns in vast amount of data that we cannot handle. So I want to add just a little thing, I think, that has not been mentioned before. One way that AI could be really useful, I think it will be into summarizing the literature. So this has not been mentioned, but I think that one of the problems we face as researchers is knowing what is known already. This, I'm very ignorant. I mean, none of us can have, I mean, we are not in the 1910s where a scientist in neuroscience could really have an idea of the state of art of neuroscience. Now there is a lot of things we don't know about our own fields, and we can get to know, but with very painful Google searches that are inefficient, or by asking to colleagues that are experts, but this may fail. So maybe it's not a dream, but I think it's possible that AI might actually really help into summarizing the existing knowledge. So I dream about a version of ChatGPT where I can just prompt and ask, do we know this already? What are the studies that cover this? And this would spare me a lot of time into asking stupid questions that have been answered before, but I don't know.
Yeah, going off of that, when ChatGPT was first released, it was near the end of my PhD, and I decided to test it. I wanted to know if it knew as much about somatostatin interneurons as I did, specific. So I was asking it things, and I was thinking, can it, repeat, what I'm doing or design my experiments and, to test it. Does it know, is it using the same nomenclature that I'm aware of for these cell types? How is it defining them? And, because at that point, I think it only had knowledge up to like 2020 or 2021, it was definitely missing some things. But I was like, okay, it's not wrong, it's on the pathway there, and it was funny. I also tried it out with, one of my friends, her dissertation was at, a mouse model of multiple sclerosis, and I'm not as familiar with neuroinflammation, so I tried to type in an experiment related to her project and was like, explain this to someone, who doesn't have this background, and it gave it to me like in layman's terms, and I sent it to her, and I was like, is this kind of accurate? And she was like, surprisingly, yes, so that's just some examples that it's helpful to understand other areas. But another area that's exciting, I think, is analyzing data that if a human were to analyze it, it would take, hundreds of years, like electron microscopy data. I've tried to manually trace, some EM data, and if, a person was just doing that, you would never get your data set finished. And so, there's some really, really massive EM data sets from the Allen Institute, that involve some sort of modeling to analyze all of that data. And then with that analysis, there's been some comparison to other data modalities, right? Because when you do electron microscopy, you don't get that transcriptomic or electrophysiological information about that cell. You get extremely detailed morphology. But there was a project going on at the Institute where they were actually modeling the EM data with like the morphology data from the patch-seq experiments, and then with that, you were able to then connect, this electron, this cell from this EM data set likely has, this transcriptomic profile and, this firing pattern, because being able to, to write a model that was able to link everything. And you just wouldn't be able to do that, technique-wise. And so I think, using AI to connect different data sets and get, a fuller picture of a cell type and not just using one modality, I think that's really exciting.
Okay, are any of you even remotely concerned about any of the ethical issues that come up when we're looking at taking human data that comes from humans' brains and manipulating it in a way that is kind of independent of us and leaving it up to technology? And yes, no?
I mean, it's well discussed, but like the biases that are within the data will be hugely emphasized, and that's kind of terrifying, right? I mean, it's terrifying that that's the data that we all collect and that there's so much of us in it. But I think of course we have to think about who is being served by these technologies and how to preserve, people's consent and dignity and anonymity as well, right? Like when you've got so much data, it's very, very hard to keep things anonymous. So truly, exactly. So I think that's something that we need to think about, and we need to think about, who's going to benefit. But I don't have any answers. I'm sorry.
Anybody else? No? I figured that one would be something people want to think about for a while. I'm going to wrap it up because we're standing between you and the reception. I want to thank all our panelists for being willing to put their feelings, ideas, and opinions out there. They will be here for the next couple of days. So if anything that has come up tweaks your interest, please come and talk to them. And let's keep this conversation going, because we've got a lot that we need to learn from these enormous data piles that we're all generating and beginning to play with. But we've also, for the most part, also got a lot to learn from each other, regardless of whether we're expert in Python or R, or whatever your favorite language is. So I want to really encourage people to start talking to people who are a little bit different from them. And that includes women who work in AI, thanks to Mike for the heads up. We've got a lot that we need to do. If we're really going to be able to integrate all of the information that we're dealing with. And I hope that this experience, being at this meeting, will begin to get some of those collaborations and interactions going that will get us a little bit closer. So thank you to everybody.